All right, good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see so many of you again. This is the second of our series on European Art History 101, with a little bit of focus on works in the collection during this lighting renovation when the permanent collection galleries are closed. Again, this is a really big subject, Renaissance art. So in terms of things that are represented in this collection, Italian is way more represented than sort of Northern art, Northern Renaissance art. We will talk about both, but we'll have more of an emphasis on Italian Renaissance art. As always, if you have any questions, if there are works in the collection, say if you're a docent and there were things that you were curious about, we can talk midway through or after. Again, this is very informal. This is not summer school. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, fabulous. So, with all those caveats in place, I for those of you who were here last time, I decided that one way to kind of get into these really big subjects like medieval or European Renaissance art would be to talk to curators that I know in these various fields and ask them what they love about their field, what they love about curating this particular era. So for today, I asked my friend Freddie Ilchman, who is curator of paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and he's also the head of an organization called Save Venice, which does really incredible work working on both architecture and various kinds of visual arts, restoring things. They just restored a huge fresco by Tintoretto in the Scuola Grande di San Rocco in Venice. So a really wonderful guy. He's there. He's in front of Titian's painting the Assumption of the Virgin in the Frati right there. So this is what he said. He said, I love curating the Italian Renaissance since this is the first historical period in Western art where we know a lot about the artists. We can assign artists' names to many paintings, sculptures, and buildings. We can, with real confidence, group works to define an oeuvre, a body of work. We know the dates of someone's birth and death, important commissions, sojourns and appointments, and more. We often know what an artist looked like, and letters and biographies can give us a sense of personalities. The literature is excellent, from Vasari to Berenson to Baxendal to the great scholars working today. So Vasari is a 16th century author, and then Berenson, late 19th century, early 20th century, Baxendal, 20th century. So he's thinking both in that era and then later we have good people writing on the Renaissance. And so I thought I'd take a little bit of inspiration from this idea of kind of the rise of the status of the artist in the Italian Renaissance, the sense of the artist as an individual, well documented, but also to play a little bit devil's advocate, I would say there are also many things that are kind of fragmentary, unknown, or cannot be known about the Renaissance. So with those ideas, and then again taking inspiration from a few works in the collection, let's see where we can go from there. So when Dr. Ilchman talks about Vasari, he means this author from Arezzo, Giorgio Vasari, who was himself a painter, sculptor, and architect. And he really pervades, if you've ever been to the Duomo, the cathedral in Florence, he helped paint the cupola of the dome. I mean, he really was a working artist and architect, but he's probably best known today for this series of biographies that he wrote called The Lives of the Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. So this started with the artist Cimabue, that's Cimabue, just because Italian pronunciation is a little bit different, in the 13th century, and going up to his own day. So this was a really new idea at the time, not the idea that you would have a series of biographies, but that painters, sculptors, and architects were worthy of having their own biographies. So if you think of who merits a biography, like that someone would buy? Who do we care about? What kinds of people? You can just shout it out. Politicians. Good.
Churches.
Sorry.
Churches.
Oh, churches. Okay. What were you saying?
Monarchs. Kings.
Monarchs, kings. Absolutely. Do you have a sense of, in this period, who would have had? Boccaccio wrote on famous men, so that was just sort of general. But so hagiographies, lives of saints, were very, very popular throughout the Middle Ages. Certainly kings, monarchs, popes, that kind of thing. And so just this format is already telling us something about the rise in the status of the artist, and that they are more kind of individuals. And so also when Freddie mentions that we know what artists look like, very often we have portraits, self-portraits, and the hundreds of lives, especially in the second edition of Vasari's lives, are accompanied by these woodcut portraits. We don't know if they always look like the actual artist, but they certainly look like the characterization that Vasari gives them in the little biography. And he made lots of stuff up and he got stuff wrong, but it's still a huge, huge accomplishment, and it's a milestone when we're thinking about the Renaissance there. So the other thing I mentioned last time is that the Renaissance named itself. That no one said, "Hey, we're in the Middle Ages. We're in the middle of something here." But someone like Vasari actually said, "We are living through a rebirth of classical antiquity." And just to get some terms very kind of straight here, classical antiquity, we really think of it happened earlier in Greece, so sort of like the building of the Acropolis, the Parthenon, Pericles, the Emperor Pericles, that kind of thing. And then Rome right around kind of the first emperors, basically. So that's Greco-Roman culture in this period, which is considered this high point of culture. And then this rebirth supposedly happened in Europe, starting in Italy, around 1400 to 1600 CE. But again, we don't really have exact dates for any of this happening, just some milestones along the way. So, and again, just to be super clear, historians and art historians use BCE, meaning before the Common Era, and CE, meaning the Common Era. And there are different ways. Archaeologists sometimes use BP, meaning before present. So it actually changes the dates of how long it happened before present. But anyway, that's just a standard within my field. So what's fascinating to think about is that Vasari, in saying that there's this rebirth that's happening in Italy, a lot of what they're looking at is somehow fragmentary, especially when we're thinking about the visual arts. So the Roman Empire had had this long decline and fall. The capital had actually moved outside of Rome, right? So Constantine moves the capital to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. The Holy Roman Empire, there were capitals at Prague and Aachen, Germany, and Magdeburg, and all these different places. And so Rome itself and the former Roman Empire in Italy really fell into disrepair. And so there were things that had been covered by layers of history, things that were in ruins, but that had this kind of aura. So there were things that were being uncovered all the time in the 15th and the 16th century. And this is really when we think about kind of archaeology becoming more of a subject or something that people were interested in. So I wanted to show you a couple of examples of the kinds of things that we're thinking about. So very famous is this torso, the Belvedere torso, and you can see that it's a sculptural fragment. So they knew that this was something that came from probably classical Rome. It has this beautiful sense of naturalism, dynamism, this kind of coiled movement of the human body, really really glorying in kind of the nude male form, which was an ideal for various reasons in ancient Greece. Athletes, Olympic athletes competed in the nude, right? So it was considered an ideal kind of state. But again, the fact that it's fragmentary was this kind of gauntlet or challenge to artists. Like, how could we complete this? How could we make it and adapt it to our own uses? So what you see, maybe some of you have seen this is still in Rome in the Vatican museums. What you're seeing on the left is a 16th century drawing after the Belvedere torso by a Flemish artist named Martin van Heemskerk. And artists like Michelangelo really were, again, they were really kind of challenged by these works and thought about how they could adapt them. So on the Sistine ceiling, maybe some of you know, there are a lot of these nude figures that are totally biblical that are again this just kind of classical eruption on the ceiling of the Pope's chapel. I don't have the title of the work here, but this is called the Apollo Belvedere. This was another fairly intact sculpture that was known to the Renaissance, and you can see these interesting kinds of adaptations happening here, where the German artist Albrecht Dürer is looking at the proportions of this kind of ideal male nude figure, and again, adapting it to a Christian context in creating Adam, the first man, and again, a kind of model for humanity here. But probably the rediscovered work that created the biggest impact was this work. Has anyone ever seen this before? Okay, some of you have seen it. And again, this is also still in the Vatican museums in a loggia. So this is the Laocöon. And some of you might know the story of the Laocöon. This is the priest who says, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," and he wants to reject the gift of the Trojan horse. And the gods are against him. There's a really beautiful I should have had the text here with you, but I don't. I'll send it afterwards. But essentially, this is the ultimate story of kind of despair and the gods being against you, right? So even the gods are kind of cheering on your destruction. So Laocöon and his two young sons get attacked and killed by these sea snakes. And so you can see them on the right and left there. And then this really kind of titanic figure of the Laocöon, who's shouting up and looking up at the heavens, is this idol of this kind of sorrow and despair and helplessness. And what was really exciting in the 16th century is that there was only a description. There was a description that was known from an ancient text from Pliny about this unbelievable sculpture that was carved out of a single piece of marble, and it so beautifully depicted this story of Laocöon, and then they found it in a vineyard outside of Rome. You can just imagine it's partially buried. Someone starts looking, there's an arm, and it was in several pieces. But people came and witnessed the unearthing of the Laocöon, including Michelangelo. And Michelangelo's art would never be the same after seeing the Laocöon. Again, I think of it as a kind of gauntlet that was thrown down. This kind of superhuman figure. It's not just about naturalism and observing the figure, but about making it kind of godlike in some ways. So you certainly see that in the Sistine ceiling, which was done right after that, and then in the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, which was done about 30 years later. And if you're thinking, so like the Apollo Belvedere might be a nice model or antitype for Adam, Laocöon became a really important model for the suffering Jesus Christ in Christian art. In some versions, Christ on the cross looks up and he says, my God, why have you abandoned me? And again, people are seeing this kind of perfect antitype in Laocöon, a way that this can be translated into their own modern contemporary day. So you will see a lot of Laocöon-like Christ figures, especially in the 16th century, right after the rediscovery of this sculpture. And so there were so many different kinds of copies that were made after ancient fragments. So you could come and you could make drawings. Eventually there would be prints made after them, and there are plaster casts that you can see as well. So that's a one-to-one, perfectly scaled option to make a copy after that. And so you see these really wonderful, I don't think I have my pointer today, but this is a totally different story about Bacchus and Ariadne. This is the Venetian painter Titian, and Bacchus is coming to save Ariadne, who's right here, who's just been abandoned on the island of Naxos, and he kind of flies out of his chariot, but he has this whole crazy retinue of people. So he has little people, and he has hunters and musicians, and then he has this guy covered in snakes, the people holding deer legs up, there's this amazing crew that he has around him. And at the time, in the 16th century, this is only maybe 15 years after the Laocöon has been rediscovered. And so an educated viewer would understand that as a quotation from that work. But in terms of, so we have some actual things. We have some actual ancient architecture. We have some actual ancient classical sculpture that is literally kind of rising from the ground, all in fragmentary form. But we don't really have examples of ancient painting. And painters were really, I would say they were very innovative in this period in the Renaissance, maybe because they were having to use so much imagination to kind of complete or to meet these classical standards. So I just wanted to mention that in the Acropolis, so this is classical Greece, there was this building that Pausanias, in his description of Greece, mentions as a picture gallery. And he says there were pictures of Diomedes taking Athena from Troy, and there are pictures from Homer, and Odysseus coming upon the women washing their clothes, and all of these different, so stories from Greek history and myth. And we don't really know much else about that tradition of having a picture gallery, right? A museum certainly wasn't a thing as far as we know, in the early modern world. We start to have these kind of princely collections, like at the Vatican, the Pope, that kind of thing. So it's super interesting that people just had this little view onto the way that painting was viewed and collected in the classical world. And one example, one very exciting example of finding actual ancient painting was the Domus Aurea, which is sometimes also called the Golden House of Nero, so the Emperor Nero, which was excavated. So it had mostly fallen, it was mostly underground at a certain point, but it was excavated in the early 16th century. And so people, including Raphael, the painter Raphael, they would go in just with candlelight and they would look at the painted motifs, the frescoes on the interior, and they had this sense of these really interesting grotesques and color field paintings. There were pictures of, the Sphinx. There were things from all over the former Roman Empire on the interior there. And so this was very exciting for someone in the 16th century. And I think this is a picture from when I went in. You can still take tours, but you have to wear a hard hat, and it is still mostly kind of underground. It's not far from the Colosseum when you're in Rome, but highly recommended if you are an art enthusiast. So they have a little bit of ancient painting, not very much. Really, painters are having to rely on descriptions, and there were such laudatory descriptions of ancient painters in sources like Pliny the Elder. So this is first century Roman author, and told all these great stories about these different painters who, again, we have no works by any of these painters. They're not otherwise documented other than in these kinds of stories. And you can really see where someone like Giorgio Vasari started to get his inspiration in telling his own stories about artists. So I'll just read quickly. So he's talking about this painter Zeuxis. And he says, the contemporaries and rivals of Zeuxis were Timanthes, Androcetes, Eupompus, and Parrhasius. This last one, Parrhasius, is said, entered into a pictorial contest with Zeuxis, who represented some grapes painted so naturally that the birds flew toward the spot where the picture was exhibited. So he was able to create the illusion that these grapes were real and the birds were fooled. Parrhasius, on the other hand, exhibited a curtain drawn with such singular truthfulness that Zeuxis, elated with the judgment that had been passed upon his work by the birds, haughtily demanded that the curtain should be drawn aside to let the picture be seen. So the painted curtain, he thinks it's created this illusion, this trompe l'oeil, fool the eye, and he says, hey, pull aside that curtain, which is actually painted. So upon finding his mistake with a great degree of ingenuous candor, he admitted that he had been surpassed. Zeuxis had been surpassed. For whereas he himself had only deceived the birds, Parrhasius had deceived him, an artist. So there are other stories like this within Pliny, but again, this created a really interesting kind of gauntlet or competition for a Renaissance artist looking back at the classical world. So it introduces a couple of interesting ideas. First of all, the idea that competition produces excellence, right? And especially a kind of homosocial competition among men, right? Men of similar status, social standing, that kind of thing. And that this produces virtue. Virtù is what Renaissance artists might say. And then secondly, and pretty obviously here, that great art, the best art, creates a convincing illusion of the natural world. And in the history of art, that's not always the case, right? So last time we looked at Byzantine icons that don't look particularly naturalistic, the very long fingers, the very small chin, very, high forehead and long nose and all of those things. It doesn't look like an observation from life, right? So that's not always the ideal. That wouldn't be the ideal in, say, ancient Egyptian art. But in this particular period of Western art history, this is the ideal. So a really great example of both of these ideas of this kind of competition to produce virtù and creating an illusion of the natural world is this artist, Battista Alberti. And this is a really sort of unusual work that I thought we could use to kind of get into portraiture and a portrait in the CMA collection. So Battista Alberti was himself a painter, although we have virtually no paintings by him, and a sculptor and an architect, who again, kind of like Vasari, is best known for his writings. So Alberti wrote on painting, he wrote on sculpture, he wrote on architecture, he wrote on optics, he wrote on horsemanship, he wrote on marriage and the family, he wrote on, pick a subject. He really was a Renaissance man in that way. And this bronze self-portrait medal, of which there are a few left in the world. This one is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Really tells us a lot about him as a Renaissance man. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how I would look at a portrait and what it can kind of just tell us superficially based on some of the decisions that the artist has made. So first of all, medium. So what medium has the artist chosen here? In this case, the medium is bronze. Now, bronze is an expensive material. This is not a humble or rustic material at all. It's not something that you'd easily be able to find locally. It's a combination of metals. And so it is, it announces itself, let's say. It's also related to metals, coins, other kinds of objects, and that parallel is supposed to be recognized there. So we're already saying that this is kind of a high status object here. Then for a portrait, I would look at, let's call it the format or the pose. And so you can see that Alberti has chosen to show himself in profile here, so in that side profile. And again, this is kind of reminding us of coins and metals. And this was, and generally speaking, the people that we would see on coins and medals are kings, rulers, right, or other figures who are very worthy of being commemorated. And this would be considered a kind of, it says row file, side profile. I don't know what happened to the B there. So it is a kind of formal pose, and it's one that has a long precedent. It also, generally speaking, it's kind of considered flattering because you don't see the asymmetry of the face, right? So it really creates this nice, crisp, geometric shape. We look at dress grooming here, right? So is he dressed in contemporary 15th century clothes or something different? And indeed, he's wearing this kind of classical knotted, almost toga-like garment here. And his hairstyle is a classical hairstyle. And it's tousled. It really looks like a kind of Roman imperial and emperor's hairstyle there, which is emphasized by the other choices that he's made there in terms of text and symbols. So you can see along the side there, he has L BAP, B-A-P, which is a Latinized shortened version of his name, Leon Battista, or Baptista in Latin. Leon is his family, his father gave him that name. Battista is a name that he adopted himself because the patron saint of Florence, where he was very proud to hail from, does anyone know? John the Baptist, right? So John the Baptist is the patron saint of Florence, so he takes on that name and he proudly proclaims it here. You might notice also that he has slightly leonine features, like his tousled hair, and that was deliberate. It was considered a good thing to have those kinds of features. And then wonderfully, it's a little bit hard to see here, but he's also included his personal emblem, which is the winged eye. So it's an eye. It even has some like nerves and things hanging out of it, but then with a wing there. And he considered the eye, he talks about it as the most godlike of senses. Good thing that he was a visual artist. And he really was very interested in optics as it related to painting, sculpture, and architecture. And in his book on painting, he talks for the first time about one-point linear perspective. So creating this scientific way, this mathematical way of, in painting, showing that recession into space towards a single point. All right. So this is, for, a fairly simple portrait, it can tell us a lot if you are kind of attuned to these various things. So I thought that we would turn now to a portrait that always seems to garner a lot of attention in the collection, this portrait of a lady with a scorpion chain. Now, I do think it's really hard to see the outlines. Maybe it's easier in the audience to see the outlines of the panel here. It sort of fades into the black background. So sorry, that's a little bit on me. So if we do the same procedure here and we think about these 4 categories, we can think, what does this portrait tell us about itself and tell us about the Renaissance? So first of all, we have a totally different medium. This is oil paint on a wooden panel. So last time when we were talking about medieval art, we were often seeing egg tempera, which is pigment mixed with egg yolk, and it dries hard and fast and really bright, and it doesn't allow for much modulation, much kind of light and shade. Looks really great against gold leaf. But for these purposes, would probably be inappropriate. So oil has a very complicated history, but it becomes way more popular. Some people even said it had its own renaissance and was reintroduced in the late 15th century. So this would be linseed or walnut oil, most likely, as the vehicle for this pigment. So this really allows for some very dramatic painterly effects here, and probably some of you know already some of these Italian words for these effects. So sfumato, meaning a smoky effect, where you don't have that kind of sharp contour line where it's almost as if something is kind of coming into being in front of you, as well as, and so sfumo just means smoke in Italian. And then chiaroscuro, which literally just means light dark. So chiaro means light, scuro means dark, and it's about that kind of contrast, especially a kind of dramatic contrast between light and dark in a painting without regard to color. So I think you really see both things, especially against this black background, how she's kind of glowing and coming into being, and that there are not these very sharp lines, contours anywhere. So the thing I think that most people react to when they see this painting is that it looks a lot like what painter? Leonardo da Vinci, that's exactly right. And so we start to get into the wild web of followers of Leonardo, which is a huge subject, but certainly painters were following these very innovative choices that someone like Leonardo was making. So we can talk about that in a second. So pose format, something completely different here from what we saw with Alberti. We have a half length and a frontal with just a slight turn of the face. Presentation of this figure. So to me, as a Renaissance art historian, this is really interesting because women were not often shown in anything but side profile before about 1500. So this was, you can think about some reasons why it was considered sort of more psychologically penetrating, a little bit more inviting and open. We tended to see women portrayed in this side profile in such a way that they could be gazed upon, but they're not gazing back and they're not offering us anything about their own interior world. So this is a roughly contemporary, slightly earlier painting by the Florentine Fra Filippo Lippi. And you can see that this woman, she's basically wearing her entire dowry. She has her finest clothes on, her veil. She has very specific rings that she's wearing, the wonderful pearls in her hair and everything. But she is really a commodified object to be kind of consumed rather than someone who is meeting your gaze or is, again, offering anything psychologically about themselves. So truly, before Leonardo, and I think probably most of us know this work, we didn't have a lot of these female portraits, and the reasons why are really kind of interesting, and again, I would say kind of fragmentary. It had much more to do with Leonardo's kind of experimenting with the medium of painting and with the format of portraiture than anything else. So you can see how this artist, possibly Boltraffio, is interested in these effects of sfumato, of chiaroscuro, and of having this kind of quiet, meditative quality of this female sitter. Again, we don't know the name. We don't know if this is a kind of ideal beauty, if this were a particular person. So most people think that the Mona Lisa was this particular person, Lisa Gherardini. But such wonderful effects of kind of, again, arrested motion or the potential for motion, a kind of flickering light that I would say is often duplicated or often imitated, never duplicated, let's say. Very, very hard to do. And even in the Cress collection database, it says attributed to Giovanni Antonio Boltraffio, right, who was one of many followers of Leonardo da Vinci. And I just wanted to say, like, there is a whole web of these followers. There was, at the National Gallery in London, there was an exhibition a few years ago about Francesco Melzi and all of these. They're actually called the Leonardeschi, right? So it was certainly a huge phenomenon of the 16th century. And then finally, and I think this might be the thing, and maybe docents can tell me better, that in terms of kind of costume and symbols, things that that have been chosen here, is this interesting scorpion chain that she's wearing. And to me, the costume of this is really very interesting. It's kind of between things that would actually exist. So women would wear these little jewels on their forehead, like sometimes they're called ferronniere. So it's sort of between reality and kind of just fantasy, like Botticelli's Flora or something with these interesting vines and things. But she does have these facing scorpions on either side, and that is often what is called Portrait of a Lady with the Scorpion Chain, which has some interesting symbolism in the Renaissance. And I can't think of a lot of other examples. There is this portrait of Elisabetta Gonzaga where she's wearing the little ferronniere with the scorpion on it. And in the Renaissance, your zodiac, your astrological sign was a really big deal. And Scorpio was the sign under which kind of fertility and pregnancy and all of these things were controlled. And so it has been said about this portrait on the right that this might have to do with the kind of wish for fertility after a long period of infertility, that kind of thing. So very frequently in portraits of women, we see references to marriage, to dowry items, to the husband's family name, and certainly to the wish for children. So that wouldn't surprise me if that were the case. It's just a kind of unusual way of incorporating it into this portrait. But Leonardo loved unusual inclusions in his female portraits. Some of you might know this one, Lady with an Ermine, which Again, Leonardo loved the ermine because he said that it would give itself up to hunters rather than soil its beautiful white coat, but it also had a kind of protective symbolism for women in pregnancy. Sometimes women had weasels and things that would attract fleas and ticks and things off them. It would go on to the animal itself. It was a different time. So anyway, it's useful, and I think especially if you are a docent and thinking about portraiture, we have a number of very nice early modern portraits in the collection. To to think about things like gender and format and pose, medium, all of those things, especially when you're looking at something in person, can really tell you something, or it can be fulfilling, rewarding to look at. So I wanted to mention as well that these are two works from the CMA collection, and the portrait of Lady with the Scorpion Chain, as far as we know, is a work in and of itself, is an independent work. But so much of Renaissance art that we see in museums was originally part of a bigger ensemble and was never really meant to be seen on its own. So I have two examples here. So the Bastiani work on the left is telling this narrative of Joseph interpreting the Pharaoh's dream. And it really only makes sense. So it would be part of this kind of Venetian narrative painting that you might see in like a confraternity or something like that. Sometimes they would be on furniture. But we definitely know that this was not made as an independent work, and it really would only make sense with the other narrative panels surrounding it. On the bottom there to the right, we have the Cozzarelli saints, which are so charming. I just really love these particular saints. You can see the long lastingness of those gold backgrounds that we saw all the way back in the Byzantine period. But then with these lovely, very almost portrait-like, individualized depictions of these saints who probably, people were named after saints. There were patron saints of cities. There were saints like Saint Roch, who protected against plague. There would be many reasons that a particular configuration of saints might be included here. But these were definitely part of a larger altarpiece. So we have these four little panels, and they're probably there was probably something big in the middle. There could be maybe a Madonna and Child, a crucifixion, something like that. And then these would be subsidiary works. They could have been along the top, at the sides. Generally speaking, the so-called predella panels at the bottom would be narrative, so they might not have been there. But it's so interesting that now they've been cut off from their original context, and we're just appreciating them for what they are, right? We're appreciating them as artifacts of the 15th century and as kind of museum works, but certainly they're not devotional works. It's not something that a priest is praying towards, or that is capturing the attention of of the devout. So something, completely different. I always want to give people like a couple of minute break, but I just wanted to mention, before we move from the Italian Renaissance, something that I'm working on, and I just got back from working on, which you are very rarely going to see in a museum, which is frescoed exteriors, painted exteriors, facades of buildings from the 16th century. And this was, this was a huge phenomenon in the European Renaissance, where even big name, Giorgione and Titian and lots of Florentine painters, Roman painters, were commissioned to paint the outsides of, say, palaces, niches on churches, various things like that. But because they're on exteriors, they're very prone to deterioration and decay. And so we don't really have a sense. Maybe some of you, if you've been in Europe before, you've noticed here and there some traces of painting, but so many of the Italian Renaissance cities, whether we're talking about Venice, Rome, Florence, Mantova, Verona, Genoa, especially Genoa, were these kind of urbs pictae. They were these painted cities. And so when I was in Venice last month, there was this 16th century fresco that's right on the Grand Canal that it's now part of a hotel complex. So this is right, the Rialto Bridge is right here. The Rialto Vaporetto stop, if you've ever been to Venice, is right in front there. And when the hotel was undergoing renovations, they found traces of this 16th century fresco. And you can see even today, kind of the brightness of the color and the idea of the human figure, the semi-draped, semi-nude human figure, out on the streets, right, out in the public, in a way that I don't think has been always understood or appreciated by art history. So a little preview, hopefully at some point I'll come and talk to you about that project as well. So let's take two, get a sip of water, just take a minute, and we'll come back and we'll talk about the Northern Renaissance for the next half. I just quickly had to shout out, since we're talking about, the Renaissance as it relates to this particular collection, just the absolute large number of apothecary mortars that we have from the Italian Renaissance, which was a particular collecting interest of Samuel Kress. And you can go on the Kress database, and interestingly, so about half of his collection of apothecary mortars, which we're used to grind like mortar and pestle, about half of them went to the National Gallery of Art in DC. But by far, the second largest number came here. And I don't know, maybe some of you know the answer for why that is particularly. I know when there was the Kress show here a couple of years ago that they showed a couple of them. But it's interesting that this makes up proportionally a lot of our collection. And I'm sorry not to talk about it in any more detail than that. These were something, so Kress displayed them in his own, in his beautiful Fifth Avenue apartment. It was something that he really liked, and maybe it had some connection to the Kress department store, to his profession. I don't really know. So again, some of you might know better than I. So let's talk a little bit about the Northern Renaissance. Like I said, in terms of this collection, this is works from outside of Italy are less represented, but a couple of important things, and then maybe a couple of things that will lead into our discussion of Baroque art next time, for those of you who can make it. So my quiz question for you is, the Northern Renaissance is responsible for introducing what type of painting to Europe? Is it A, landscape, B, portraiture, C, history painting, or D, graffiti? So by show of hands, who thinks it's A, landscape? You can put your hand up just so you don't embarrass yourself. B, portraiture, C, history painting, D, graffiti? Okay, interesting. So the answer that I was thinking of is A, landscape painting. And these things pre-existed the Northern Renaissance. When I say history painting, it's narrative painting that of history, mythology, or the Bible, generally religious scenes. And that was what Alberti said was the top product of the painter, was the historia, or history painting. So just a couple of things I wanted to talk about. Where is the North? What does that mean? Winter is coming. And then a couple of major developments. I think we'll talk a little bit about the Reformation and Counter-Reformation next week when I talk about Baroque. But really, landscape and printmaking are two of the important ones. So the Northern Renaissance produces, I think, some of the best known works of art in the history of art. We have Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini, sometimes called Arnolfini Wedding Portrait, on the left, which is in the National Gallery in London. And then just a work that I absolutely love, Albrecht Dürer's Rhinoceros woodblock print on the right. But when we say the North, we're really kind of meaning anything that's not Italy in Europe. I mean, really, so it's kind of modern day Netherlands, Belgium, France, Germany, Luxembourg, sometimes Portugal and Spain are included in kind of Northern Renaissance textbooks, a bit of England, Czech Republic, Prague. So a lot of things. Again, this is not an era that named itself. You know, they weren't saying, "Oh, we're the Renaissance of the North." So sort of Northern Europe, but again, meaning just kind of north of the Alps, north of Italy. And one important thing to remember that we talked about last time is that we don't have kind of consistent rule at this time. You know, Italy is a younger nation than the United States. Italy's, the Risorgimento only happened in the 1860s. But so we have the kind of lumbering Holy Roman Empire that's happening. Whoops. Oh, I don't know why I can't show this. There. So you can see how it kind of changes and shifts and expands and contracts over this period up until the 18th century. So established by the successors of Charlemagne, but the rule is never as centralized. We do have some really interesting early Holy Roman emperors like Charles IV in Prague, who were responsible for some very beautiful building projects and kind of styles of art and painting that were very particular to them. But I would say it's a little bit more granular and scattered as we get into the Northern Renaissance. So with that wholly inadequate introduction, I just wanted to talk about a couple of things that really stand out to me about the Northern Renaissance. And first is this idea of the kind of observation of nature and of landscape. Sometimes the rediscovery of the natural world is something that is caught up with this idea of the Renaissance. But there really does seem to be this sudden surge of images that really try to duplicate the appearance of the natural world. And, if we were talking in the first part of this about who gets a biography, who gets a portrait, who gets this kind of treatment, all of a sudden we have this piece of grass, right? This clump of dirt and grass and, maybe a few bugs and everything that is given this kind of exquisite, almost microscopic treatment, and is in some ways, it's not a huge work of art, but it is kind of monumentalized in this way. And so sometimes this is called the ars nova, or the new art of the 15th and early 16th century. This is Albrecht Dürer, the great painter and printmaker of the early 16th century. He dies 1528, so I would not be surprised if we'll see some 500-year Dürer exhibitions and things in a few years. I don't know if they're planning anything in particular, but it's one thing to keep an eye out for, because Dürer's work really reward being seen in person. So this idea of kind of investigating the natural world in earnest is really something new. And again, we're talking about origin points here. Where could we place this origin? There are things like Petrarch's ascent of Mont Ventoux, climbing a mountain just for the experience of it, for the kind of spiritual experience, the description of the natural world. In Germany, people were very proud of their kind of primitive forests. They were very proud of their landscapes, right? So it was like they thought humanity came out of this, you know, primeval bog and these wonderful deep, the Urwald, like these originary forests, these thick forests. And so I do think you see, strangely enough, this is a very patriotic kind of image, and Dürer saying that he's very proud of his own natural landscape here. And so I always describe landscape as something where the margins start to invade the center. So you will have these beautiful religious paintings of like the adoration of the Magi, or you know, a scene from Ovid, Apollo and Daphne or something, and you can see the artist just getting very interested in that landscape background and the margins there. And slowly, it's like the human figures get smaller and smaller and become less and less of the focus of attention, and the landscape kind of takes over and becomes a subject in and of itself. And certainly Alberti would not say that landscape was a worthy subject of painting. He says you need to talk about, you know, the actions of great men, right? Or maybe, you know, portraits, or still life was kind of down there on the hierarchy. But this is something that really, really takes shape in the North. And I would say that the real father of landscape, just independent landscape paintings, would be this German painter, Albrecht Altdorfer. And again, very few signs of kind of human habitation. You know, you do have a path there, so you have a sense, you know, there might be little towns in the background, but it really is, it would have seemed so subversive at this time to have a picture without human subjects. But it becomes very popular. There are prints that are made after this kind of work, and sometimes they might be reintegrated into the background. You know, it would be used as inspiration for the background of a religious painting or something like that. But Dürer, one of the, if we think about for someone like Michelangelo seeing the Laocöon as being this hugely epochal kind of moment in his life, Dürer went at least once, maybe 2 times to Venice. So he's from Nuremberg in southern Germany. He takes one very famous trip to Venice, and he also travels north to the Netherlands. And so he is he's very impressed by Venetian religious painting, particularly altarpieces, paintings of the Madonna and Child. And he's really integrating kind of Italian formats and styles into his own work. And I think that that's one of the reasons that he became such a wonderful, well-rounded painter and printmaker. And I'm thinking, I'm missing a couple of slides here, so I'm sorry, but maybe I can send afterwards. So landscape, certainly a revolution of the time. And then the other thing that I've kind of mentioned a little bit throughout the talk is printmaking. So you probably know that movable type is an innovation, the printing press of the 15th century. And printing was something that allowed for the cheap circulation of all of these wonderful motifs, ideas, styles. It was a way for artists to advertise themselves. So, you know, someone might not be able to afford an Albrecht Dürer altarpiece or portrait, but maybe would be able to afford an Albrecht Dürer print. And this example, so this is a print that's in the CMA collection here, is a really nice example of a very, very important work of print, what's called an incunable, an early printed work that's usually called the Nuremberg Chronicle. So Nuremberg is where Dürer is from. It was also a very, very important printing center of this early period. And the chronicle was kind of a bit of everything. It's this kind of encyclopedic work of supposedly showing all the major world cities. It had biblical history. It had lives of saints. It was this, I think it was 336 pages, so this big, big volume that was printed. Beautiful integration of woodblock prints and text using movable type. And what we're seeing here, so this is in the CMA collection, is something that someone has gone with an X-Acto knife and they have cut out just this view of the walled town. And if you were to ever so gingerly flip it over on the other side, you can see how it's cut out and what's on the other side of the page there. So it's very rare for an institution to own the entire Nuremberg Chronicle. I mean, that certainly does exist, but it's much more common that an art dealer, an unscrupulous art dealer, let's say, or collector, might say, oh, wow, I could make a lot more money if I individually sold off the pages or the little motifs from this work. And that's not to say that there was any ill dealing in the museum's acquisition of this particular print. And I'm actually very happy to have it for when I'm teaching, but it's just very, very common practice. The CMA has a wonderful collection of works on paper, but as you can probably imagine, works on paper are highly ephemeral and they can't be on display for very long. So you've probably walked through the works on paper gallery where the lights turn off and turn back on. Hopefully they turn back on. Sometimes I go in there and it's just dark for a second. And so these, the works, especially the Renaissance works on paper, are very rarely shown. But I'm hoping at some point, maybe with my master's students or something, we can do a little show up in that gallery, because we have 3 really beautiful prints by Dürer, including a really incredible Madonna and Child woodblock, and some engravings and different things. So what do I want to say here? So the wood, has anyone done woodblock printing before? So it's replicable, right? You can make multiples of it, which is Beatrix Louise, my daughter in the back, saying, I did it. So you actually do it on the end grain of the wood. You don't do it like, if you had a 2x4, you're not doing it into that surface. You're doing it on the end. And they were very, very sturdy. And so you could make, many, many replications of a particular woodblock. And what I really like about this one is that you can see that it's just called View of a Walled Town. And actually, within the Nuremberg Chronicle, this represents a number of different towns, I think 5 different world cities. So they weren't all observed from life, but they kind of said, oh, well, Jerusalem had a wall and and a moat and these different things. And so it actually gets repeated throughout the thing. Sometimes they get hand-colored. But woodblock is the first kind of popular printmaking that's made on a wooden surface. Then you have engraving, which started out on a metal plate, usually a copper plate, where you make an incision into the plate. You cover it with ink so that the ink goes into those grooves. You put wet paper on top of it, and you put something over it so that the paper goes into the grooves and picks up the ink, and then pull it off. And then eventually you have etching, which the incisions are made with an acid solution. So woodblock is, you're thinking 2 different ways, woodblock and engraving, in terms of positive and negative space. And people generally thought, as the Renaissance wore on, that engraving was a more sophisticated medium. You had finer lines with this kind of stylus on the surface. But one person, I would say, who never gave up on woodblock was Albrecht Dürer, and I would say that he's probably the premier Renaissance woodblock printer. And where did he train? He trained in Nuremberg in the workshop of Michael Wohlgemuth. So I'm unfortunately missing a couple of Dürer slides. I don't know what happened there, but I will open it up for questions if anyone has anything about the Northern Renaissance. Okay, hearing none, I will see, hopefully I'll see many of you next week when we talk about Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and Baroque. We'll go for Baroque next time. Thank you so much for coming, for your questions, and hopefully see you next week.